Miss Owens? Here. Thank you.
Okay. Did everyone get a chance to review the minutes from December 10th, 2014?
Madam Chair, I move to accept the draft minutes of the last meeting as submitted.
Now you're on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moldaver, for that motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
I'll abstain. I wasn't here.
Okay, none opposed. Mr. Bullock abstains. Do we have any agenda adjustments?
No adjustments, Madam Chair, but I would like to acknowledge and welcome Penny Owens, who was appointed by City Council to the Creeks Advisory Committee in December and to a 4-year term. And so welcome, Penny. And Penny will be taking over the spot that was occupied by Leanne French, who was appointed to the Parks and Rec Commission. So welcome, Penny, and you're free to say anything you'd like if you want to tell us about anything about yourself, or you can wait and we'll find out. Yeah, just push the button.
No, thanks. I'm excited to be here and support the great work that the Creeks Division is doing however I can. So it's great to meet all of you, and I look forward to working together.
Thank you. Any public comment? Seeing none? Okay. Committee member and staff communications.
No.
All right. Business items. We'll start with the street sweeping program and history review. Good evening.
So good evening. My name is Browning Allen. I'm the Transportation Manager in the Public Works Department. I'm responsible for the street maintenance program, downtown parking, and the transportation planning, alternative transportation program. In the audience is also Rick Fulmer. He's the Streets Manager in the Public Works Department, and he supervises the street sweep program along with other street maintenance issues. So when I was putting my PowerPoint presentation together, I saw that I was here before this committee in 2012 talking about street sweeping, and not a lot has changed other than some of the financial things that I'll go over in the report. And I think you got a copy of a memo that I had prepared for our Public Works Director that summarizes the history of our program and where it is at this point in time. So that's a part of backup. We have our street sweeping program, and we have expanded over a number of years. Prior to 2002, we only swept the commercial areas of the city. We began a pilot program on the west side in 2002, very successful, and through that the council asked us to look at expanding it. So in 2003, we implemented an east side sweeping. 2004, we did the upper east side, the west side, Samarkand area. 2006, the Hidden Valley, Campanile Hill. In 2007, we did the Upper Mesa, TV Hill. And in 2008, the final expansion area was the San Roque area. We have, in the commercial area, we're sweeping about 80 curb miles, probably up to about 90 curb miles with the addition of the Cliff Drive, Las Casitas. The city took over State Route 225 from the Caltrans just about a year ago, and that added 10 curb miles to our sweeping program. And we primarily focus on the downtown core and the arterial streets. And the downtown core, we're sweeping 4 nights a week, and the arterial streets, we sweep once a week. The frequency of the sweeping in the residential area on the east side, west side, and the West Beach, that's weekly. And we do it weekly because we are picking up a lot of debris in those areas, and they are enforced in terms of parking regulations. We sweep the rest of the city twice a month. And just to kind of give you an idea of what those areas are, we have the west side and the west downtown. This was the first area we began street sweeping in 2002. So so this is where the miles go. So this area here that's colored in. And then the east side was the second area. It's basically the lower east side and the east side, and this small portion over here. And then the upper east side, the west side, that wasn't part of the original area, Samarkand, the West Beach, down over here were added in 2004. And then the Campanile Hill and the Mesa area. And then the TV Hill, Portezuelo, Bel Air area. And then the San Roque area. So in the areas that, other than the east side and the west side, it's not enforced in terms of parking citations. We don't have any no parking signs, except for those streets that are adjacent to a commercial area or where we have apartments or we have a lot of parking issues. Our goal in our street sweeping program is to be able to get in the neighborhoods and hit 85% of the curbs, and we are successful in doing that. So with our program, we are sweeping right around a little over 80% of the city streets. The areas that we're not sweeping that are in the city limits, basically this area here, they're either too narrow, too windy, too hilly, or remote. We did add a few streets off of Eucalyptus Hill in this area right over here by Cleveland School. They're flat, more flat. They're wide enough to get a sweeper by, have a car parked, and they do have curb and gutter. But if we don't have curb and gutter, if they're narrow, windy, we're not going to sweep them. It's just not safe for the residents who live on those streets as well as the operator of the street sweeper. We have an agreement with the street sweeping company where they can dump the debris at our yard, and we pick up a variety of things, most of it being foliage, but we do pick up bottles, paper, plastics, especially in the neighborhoods on the west side that are adjacent to the downtown, because a lot of the people who park in the neighborhood are folks that work in the downtown. So our debris totals in the year 2014, our fiscal year 2014, was almost 5 million tons, or pounds, or almost 2.4 million tons, or 1,000 tons. And when we did a calculation of how many pounds per curb mile are we picking up, and on average it's 240 pounds per curb mile. 4 million, 5 million pounds of debris is a lot of debris that we're taking off our roads. And this slide here, this is a historical of the amount of debris. We weren't fully implemented until this year here, 2009. And you can see it's been fairly consistent over, in terms of the amount of debris, and it's going up. And we're finding with the drier years, we are picking up a little more debris, not as much debris washing out. And the other issue is because we've had a lot of drier years, we're sweeping pretty much almost every day. And when we do have a rainy day when there's water flowing in the gutter, we cancel street sweeping. Otherwise, all we'd be picking up is water. So because we're out there more often than we had been in wet years, we're picking up more debris. We do continue to do the parking enforcement. We pay the police department. They have provided 3 parking enforcement officers to provide the parking enforcement. They are out in front of our street sweeper to do the parking citation. We have signed most of any area where we are doing enforcement is signed. And we just have one area, the San Marquin area, where we have a different methodology in terms of parking restrictions. In that neighborhood, we have posted the entire neighborhood, the entrance to the neighborhood, no parking on street sweeping days, instead of alternating the sides of the street. And that was based on a couple of neighborhood meetings we had with the residents who didn't want to have a lot of signs posted in our neighborhood. And we said we would try it as a trial, and if it works, we'll leave it. If it's a problem where we're getting the citations dismissed by the courts, we would change it. And we've had some challenges, and all of them have been, the program has been upheld, where they have not dismissed a parking citation. This chart here just shows the history of our parking citation revenue. Our residential program relies heavily on the revenue that we receive from parking citation. When we back in 2006, we were at almost $1 million in parking citation revenues. Then it's been dropping over the years. Part of it is because in I can't see the year. I think it was in 2008 or 9. We started paying the police department $5 per parking citation ticket for their back house administrative work for overseeing the citation program. And then later on, the parking citation ticket went up. It went from $32 to went from $32 to $45, then to $48. So now people are paying almost $50 for a parking ticket. So we think that has helped in changing their behavior. We are still receiving quite a bit of money in terms of parking citation revenue, but not nearly what we were seeing in the early years when we had fully implemented the program. So our sweeping program is contract only. We have a company called Continental Janitorial Services. They're here in Santa Barbara area. The residential contract is $212,467. Commercial is $120,581. Next year will be the last year of a 5-year contract, and we will be going out to bid before the end of the next fiscal year to get a new sweeper contractor on board. We were really fortunate the last time we went out to bid where we actually saw a reduction in the price that we were paying, and we pay a per curb mile to the contractor. And that contractor wound up not able to perform very well, so we went to the next lowest bidder, who was the previous contractor, and the price was still lower than what he was charging the year before. It's kind of up in the air as to what kind of numbers we're going to see. If the gas prices stay low, we might continue to see low prices for our contract. But we have to wait and see. This slide here just shows our expenses for the residential street sweeping program. We have salary and benefits. We have minimal salary staff charges in both the commercial and the residential program. Over the past few years, we have been removing as much personnel costs out of both programs as possible. The people who are left in this program are the ones who oversee the program. So we feel this is appropriate to have the cost there. The allocated expenses, those are what we are charged from the finance, and we have split them between the commercial and the residential. The residential being the larger program, more of the costs are in this program than we have in the commercial account. This number here, contractor and supplies and services, the third one, that's basically most of that money goes towards paying for the sweeping contractor. And then our stormwater permit, and then other miscellaneous supplies and services, and then the final number is how much we pay the police department to provide the parking enforcement. So this slide here is just showing how we pay for the program. We get $646,000 in parking citation revenue. That's the money that the police department transfers over to the Public Works Department on a monthly basis based on the number of citations that are issued and that are actually paid by the people who receive a parking ticket. What's not included in there is parking tickets that may go unpaid that they have to go after and might take months before that money is collected. And then the money we get from the Measure B program, $115,000. Over the years, when we first started the program, the council appropriated $150,000 in Measure B funds to go towards the residential program. And then the city administrator's direction was every year to increase that by 3% to keep the program balanced. Last year, when we were meeting with the city administrator and looking at the budget, we're looking to see how much money was coming in the program, basically take into consideration some of the concerns from Cameron and his staff and this committee. We took a look at how much money Creeks was actually submitting towards the program and reduced that substantially for the current fiscal year. And it was a 41.5% reduction. So what we did for the current fiscal year for the residential program is we look at our cost for the program, how much parking citation revenue we anticipate receiving, and the difference between the two is what we ask for Measure B funding. And that's the methodology we plan on continuing to do. So as long as the parking citation revenue stays strong and the street sweeping contractor keeps his numbers low, we think the amount of money that will be coming from the Measure B program will be less than what has been historically. So it was a pretty significant drop in cost. And that's my presentation. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have, and Rick Fulmer is here to answer anything that I maybe missed or can't answer. So,
Thank you, Mr. Allen, for the presentation.
Sure.
Does anybody have questions?
I've got a question, Mr. Allen. Special congratulations to Mr. Fulmer and his team. They're doing an excellent job, and now that the mini depression is over, trying to get caught up on street patches and chuck holes and things which had to be deferred a long time. I appreciate that Mr. Armstrong, before his retirement, when he and Mr. Samaria were putting Band-Aids across all the different programs to make the budget work without, layoffs of staff, that these kind of creative solutions were really necessary. But as I have reviewed the charge for Measure B to the voters and from the council to the committee, I'm hoping now that the financial emergency is over that we see some kind of a clear nexus between streets being cleaned in proximity to city creeks versus those that are just being done for cosmetic and political reasons. And I don't object to that as the former president of the Allied Neighborhoods Association. We used to hear for years, well, why is the downtown always being cleaned and our neighborhood, is filthy? So I know where that pressure is coming from, but I didn't see in your report what the nexus is between our subsidy to this program and streets that are being cleaned in direct proximity to creeks where if the debris was left there, they might add to the pollution. That's number one. And number two, I'm sure you and Mr. Samario talk to Mr. Mannix all the time, but now that the financial emergency is over, have you ever considered revisiting your overhead cost for the police, which also went up during tough budget times? Because if we're having fewer tickets at a higher price, it could be that they don't need 3 people doing it. Perhaps they could do 2 or 1.8 or something like that. And that differential would be more than enough to offset whatever the new contract is or whatever the drop-off in Measure B funding would be.
Let me answer your second question first. We have talked to the police department about their charges, and they feel that they are still appropriate charges. In terms of the number of parking enforcement officers that are out there, it's a matter of the number of people who are parking their cars on the streets. We still have a lot of cars parked on the street on the west side and the east side, and all 3 enforcement officers are out there on street sweeping days, and all 3 of them are busy, and they try and stay in front of the street sweeper and not be behind it. Because the last thing people want to have happen is the sweeper goes by and they get a parking ticket. Obviously, if it's real clear to the parking enforcement officer that the sweeper had to go around the car, and the way they know that is they can see the trail of water going around the car, they'll probably go ahead and issue them a ticket anyway, but they don't want to have to go back and get a ticket or fall so far behind that they don't know if a car has come in after the sweeper's gone by or not. So that's why they have 3 enforcement officers on the route. And they're doing a really good job for us, and they have guaranteed us that they will always have the full complement of parking enforcement officers out there during our street sweeping program. Because we rely on the revenue. The revenue is paying for the lion's share of this program. In terms of the nexus between Measure B and the program and creeks and all that, pretty much a lot of our storm drains do flow into the creeks. When my staff was putting together the memo that I gave to our director, they went through and found some of the old material that the council put together when they were putting Measure B on the ballot. And one of the things that they put in their argument was adding the street sweeping program. This is one way of adding the street sweeping program. In terms of how much we're providing, you can see we've reduced the number substantially, and we think we'll be able to keep it fairly low in terms of the Measure B allocation towards this program. But without the Measure B allocation, we will not be able to provide the type of service we're providing right now for our residents. Questions have come up, well, why don't you cut back in the amount of sweeping you do? Well, if we cut back on the frequency of sweeping over on the west side and the east side, we're going to see a corresponding drop in revenue. So we're not really going to gain anything because we won't be generating the type of revenue we're generating right now to be able to afford the program.
I will follow up on that point.
Okay.
I live in an area that's swept every week,
Mm-hmm.
and so if the area were swept once every other week, like the Samarkand or another neighborhood that's every other week, then overhead costs would go down, so you wouldn't need as much revenue to fund it, right?
Yeah, we have corresponding drop-off in revenue, corresponding drop-off in expenses as well. Obviously, we'd have to sit down with the police department and negotiate it. But our experience has shown in some of these areas, especially on the west side, we are picking up a lot of debris. And depending upon the time of the year, it may actually cost us more money because the sweeper might have to make multiple passes because they can't pick up the debris. And what we're finding in a lot of the neighborhoods is people, when they know the sweeper's coming by, they push their leaves and other debris into the street for the sweeper to go over. And sometimes they'll make a double pass. Sometimes they'll pick up where they can and leave it on the road. So I haven't done the math, but I think we would still have a budget shortfall even if we were to cut down on the frequency. Even though our costs would go down, the revenue would go down in accordance with that. So you can almost kind of do the math on the back of a napkin. If you cut back to 50%, our cost would be 50%. They'll still have basically the same difference between the two.
Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying. It's going to vary per season and given what's going on in the city. But then getting back to Mr. Moldaver's question, what assessment is made as to whether or not it is necessary to be sweeping in certain neighborhoods every week versus every other week, and how often is that assessment made?
Well, we take a look at the amount of debris we're picking up in the neighborhoods, and we know some neighborhoods we're picking up more debris than others. And we know on the west side, because our debris totals on the west side have not fluctuated very much since we started the program. They're remaining pretty constant in the amount of debris we're picking up. So that's what's telling us the frequency. If we were to see a significant drop-off in the amount of debris we're picking up on the streets, then we think, hey, maybe we should cut back. We know the streets the areas where we're sweeping every other week or twice a month, we're not going to gain anything if we were to sweep those weekly. So twice a week is sufficient. But if you look at like the west side and compare it to some of the other neighborhoods, we're picking up by sweeping weekly almost as much as we're picking up in areas where we're sweeping twice a month. And so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the debris totals when we make decisions. And we rely heavily on the contractor and the staff. What's out there? What is he seeing out there? And he basically made some recommendations in terms of frequency too. And it's not a matter of making money. It's a matter because he can use his staff in other areas. It's a matter of what's good for our community because he does live in the city of Santa Barbara, so he does care about our community as well.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I check with one follow-up? Because there was something in the staff report that was new information to me, and it's the cost for the parking enforcement is the highest single line item cost in the street sweeping program budget. And one of the things that it says here that I did not know before was that there are 3 full-time parking enforcement officers working 10-hour shifts, but the parking enforcement for street sweeping is only 6 hours during a day. It's 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. And so there's 40% of the time that those people are on their shift, they're not doing street sweeping enforcement. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear and that the committee's clear and that what it says in here is that 40% of what I believe the street sweeping program is paying for the full time. So about 40% of that time is not actually doing street sweeping. Is that am I reading that right?
That's fairly accurate, and they're doing other parking enforcement related things. Whether it be having cars that have more than 5 unpaid parking tickets towed or abandoned vehicles. Typically you may not put them on another route. They'll stay in the area or the neighborhood and do other things. They may fill in for a PEO that's out in another route, but they do find other work for them to do. And a lot of them are actually during this time appearing in court on citations that are being challenged as well. So there's a variety of things they're doing. Are we ever going to get a full 10 hours out of the parking enforcement? Probably not, even if we had a program that was 8 or 9 hours a day, because there's going to be some downtime. They have the briefing in the morning, and they have the administrative things they have to do as well. But yeah, we're getting about 6-7 hours out of them on a daily basis.
Okay, but paying for
100%. And we have talked to the police department about it.
I know you have. I just never saw these numbers before, and just want to make sure I was reading them right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Bullock.
So I'd like to thank you for looking at the budget and decreasing the amount that the Creeks contributes. That was a really appreciated thing. That's a big reduction.
Yeah, it was a team effort. It wasn't just me. It was a
Okay,
team effort.
well, yeah, thank you very much for doing that. And then I see that the price of the parking tickets hasn't changed in close to 5 years now. Any thoughts on increasing the cost so that your revenues will increase as well?
That's a tough one. You know, my initial reaction to that, in fact, Mr. Fulmer and I have talked about it, is I really don't want to see the price of the parking tickets to go up any more than they already have. You know, we were seeing more revenue coming in when the parking tickets were at $32 a ticket versus $48. You know, you're getting a parking ticket; it's costing you $50, almost $50. You know, processing fee and all that. So
I mean, no one wants it.
Yeah, nobody wants it. Expensive. You know, I've heard of people who, when it were at $32 a ticket, you know, that was just the cost of living in the neighborhood, and you know they were willing to pay that. You know, but when they're getting a $48 parking ticket, they think twice about it and move the car. If we bump it up to $52, $55, we might see a corresponding reduction in the number of parking tickets. But I think we're covering our costs. You know, so 48 is, I think, right now is a good number. But it really is up to the police department to take a look to see if they feel it's time to adjust the parking citation revenue or rates.
And then one follow-up question. In the staff report, these numbers that you have in here as far as budget and expenses, are these like from your budget or are they estimates?
They're from our budget.
Okay.
Those are the numbers for the current fiscal year.
Okay, because I saw a couple of places where there was some price difference or cost differences, like the citation revenue that transfers from the PD to the residential program. The way I looked at it, it should have been like $40,000 higher than what is listed on here.
They give us a number, and that's what we put in the budget. So we get our revenue estimates, and they tell us what we're supposed to be transferring over.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Allen, thank you for the presentation. To follow up on one of Mr. Bullock's points, why was the ticket price increased if we had more revenue back when it was at $32, you said?
You're checking my memory. So I know a lot of it had to do with court cost. A lot of the money, the increase in the parking citation, wasn't just for the street sweeping, it's parking tickets in general for the downtown core and other areas where we have time limit parking. And it was fees that the court required cities that are issuing parking tickets charge. So it's going to the courts. I think one was a 911 fee. I can't remember. They were basically court charges.
So does that mean that the court charges were $13, or was there?
I can't remember. There was part of it was court costs, and I think part of it had something to do with some admin issues over in the police department. But there's a combination of additional revenue the police department was trying to seek, as well as court charges.
Okay. It just seems like to me if if we were getting more revenue from a decreased ticket price before, that'd be sort of a win-win for everyone, including people who frequently get tickets and for the funding for the program. But if it's just overhead costs completely, then I guess I understand that. Let's see. What is the current target for the street sweeping reserves? Do you have a
I don't have that
shooting for?
number handy. Where are we at right now, Rick? About 250? About 240. You know, that's a good number. We want to keep it right around that number. You know, we were at over $1 million. We were about $1 million, $2 million, $5 million when the recession hit. 240, 245 is a good number. You know, we have a year where our cost goes up. You know, because one of the things that's in the contract, the sweeping company, is if we see a spike in the gas prices, he can come in and ask for an additional allocation to cover his additional costs. So that's one of the reasons why we have the reserve fund. But much more than 250 is probably not something that we need. We have built up a pretty healthy reserve. One of the things that we were at one point considering is, the possibility of doing sweeping in-house, commercial sweeping. And that's, so if we were going to buy equipment, the reserve fund would have gone towards that. Since then, it's in my report. We surplused out the city sweeper, and the load that our staff was covering was picked up by the contractor, and he is more than able to take care of the additional workload. in the special suites, in addition to the parades and special events we have downtown, if we have a cement truck that dumps a load or a trash truck that dumps a load, and we have our fire department PD calls us out, goes out to take care of that type of work, or if there's some areas in the town where we're not sweeping on a regular basis, but it needs to be addressed, that's a special sweep, so we'll have the contractor go out and do that, and that's something we used to do by staff with our in-house sweeper. Oops.
So it seems like from the budget that there's no money going into the reserves for this year. Is that correct?
That's correct, because
Okay.
we made the budget right on based on our estimate for revenue and our expenses, and right now we're hitting the budget
Right.
pretty much on target.
Okay.
You know, basically any money that would go on reserve is any money that we save in our supplies and services that we don't spend.
Great. Then, let's see. I've got a few more. I apologize.
That's fine. No, that's why I'm here.
So, one of the things that stuck out to me was that the NPDS stormwater permit cost was under the residential program. I was wondering if you might go into why that might be. And the reason I ask that is because, you know, it's been one of the hard lines for this committee that we don't fund the permit fee. And I understand that, you know, based on the fact that it's in the residential pot, you could say that the police department revenue is funding that. But if the Creeks Committee is, you know, making up the shortfall in the residential program, it seems to me that it's pretty reasonable to say that we're funding the fee on that. But that was more of a comment than a question, I guess.
And just to be clear that, correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, I believe 2/3 of the permit fee is in residential and 1/3 of it's in commercial. It's all in residential?
Yeah.
Right. So what Rick said is it's part of our MPDS program. We are doing sweeping, and that's why we were requested to put the permit into the sweeping program.
Did you want
Say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I would just jump in. This is the first time I've seen that in here, and I think that that does go against the funding guidelines that have been adopted for this program to use Measure B funds to pay that permit fee. It's specifically called out as something that should not be funded with Measure B funds, and I think it went to City Council. It's been to City Council, and the City Council direction was that the street fund is responsible for paying that permit fee. So I think that that's a valid point. I wasn't aware that was being paid for out of the Measure B fund.
Well, it is in the adopted budget. It did go before our City Council. You know, one could argue that Measure B is funding, paying for it. You know, we're saying the parking citation revenue is paying for basically, which really could be considered general fund monies, or streets funds are paying for the permit. You know, so you could argue, well, hey, we're paying for part of the parking enforcement, you know, for that matter. So, you know, we're asking Measure B to pay for the differential and how much we're receiving in revenue and the cost for the program. You know, so we could break the program down with saying, well, you know, parking citation revenues are covering the MPDS permit and part of the staffing, and Measure B is covering what we can't afford to pay for out of the parking citation revenue. You know, but because we have a pretty substantial amount of money coming in from citation revenues, you know, I argue that this program, the Measure B program, is not paying for the permit.
Okay, and a question on the residential part of the program. There's $31,000 for supplies and services, which is pretty substantially more than supplies and services for the commercial program. Just wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
Well, the commercial program, you know, the total budget for that is like $120,000 for the contractor. This is a bigger program. That's why. You know, it's a bigger program. Most of our expenses are in the residential because it's a much bigger program. If you look at the 80% of the city that's being swept, you know, I would say 80% of that 80% is in the residential area, not the commercial. That's why there's the big difference between the two.
Well, I'll just say that, if we're doing it proportionally, it seems like the commercial should be taking up a larger share of that, but I understand your point. I wanted to go back to, just to clarify, the neighborhoods that are being enforced and aren't being enforced. You said that in the neighborhoods that aren't being enforced, which is it just San Roque? Is that?
No, there's quite a few neighborhoods.
And the commercial district.
Yeah, and well, here's one example here. This is the Laura Mesa, Hidden Valley, Campanile Hill. Those aren't being enforced primarily because there aren't cars parked on the street.
Okay,
that's
that was
that's
my
why.
question.
So the direction we received from City Council as we expanded the program, when we went to Council with the expansion plan, is only put no parking signs in neighborhoods where you absolutely have to do it because there's a lot of cars parked on the street. So we came back, if we're successful in sweeping 80%, 85% of the curb, we won't do enforcement. And we're successful in these neighborhoods. That's why they're not being enforced. We have, over the years, when we had parking problems, have added a few streets to being enforced, but not a whole lot. And they were primarily close to arterials, no commercial zones.
That's fair. Thank you. And then I think this is the final question for now. Sorry, everyone. Let's see. Where was that number? Well, I saw that, you put in an example of San Roque getting about somewhere around 300 pounds per curb mile swept. And this goes back to Ms. DeSmith's point about how it's determined that, it's twice a month versus every week. Is maybe I'm just not reading the numbers right, but it seems like San Roque was at the higher end there, so shouldn't it be a potential candidate for more frequent sweeping?
Well, 2 points on that neighborhood. One, there's a lot of trees. It is swept twice a month, but 90% of that neighborhood is not enforced. So if we swept it more frequently, our costs would go up correspondingly. So we figure we're successful. We're not getting a lot of complaints from the residents. We are picking up a lot of debris because there are a lot of trees in that neighborhood. We think twice a month is the minimum we should be sweeping that neighborhood. Yeah, we would like to sweep it more frequently, but we know the program just can't afford to sweep it more frequently than we're currently doing.
Thank you.
Sure, not a problem.
So then a follow-up to that response would be, well, then what is it about the other neighborhoods that necessitate weekly sweeping, that justify the cost there that wouldn't up in San Roque or similar neighborhoods?
Well, if you look at the west side, because I'm going to keep going back to the west side and east side, that's where the majority of our parking citation revenue is coming out. That means cars are parked on the street. That means the sweeper's not hitting the 85% of the curb. That means we have to come back on a regular basis to sweep. If we were to go to twice a month, even though our costs would go down, the revenue would go down, the amount of debris that we would pick up will go up probably substantially. That means the contractor would have to come back to the city yard more frequently to dump his hopper because he's picking up debris. So our costs, we probably wouldn't see as an equal amount reduction in cost because of the amount of debris that we're picking up on the street. The fact that we're seeing the same amount of debris, the pounds of debris in that neighborhood tells us we're sweeping it the right amount of time.
And you said you get reports about the nature of the debris generally that's being picked up?
Are we still getting those reports?
We check it periodically. We'll take a load over to Marburg. We'll weigh it on the scale, so we'll compare it to what we estimated we're picking up, and we'll also see what kind of debris is in there.
And have you noticed a difference in the nature of the debris that you're picking up in certain neighborhoods, like those that are swept more frequently versus those that aren't, so that I can get a sense of maybe the effect it might be having on the creeks?
We're seeing a lot of plastic bottles and a lot of coffee cups and those kinds of things in the debris, and then sometimes there's a lot of broken glass and things along those lines, and consistently.
Okay, Mr. Bullock, did you have a question? No. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, very good explanations. Thank you. I've got three quick unrelated things. as the former president of the San Roque Neighborhood Association, and for those of us watching on TV, because this is a very highly rated show,
Here it's like one of the top-rated shows.
I think it's worth noting when you go to present your next presentation that San Roque actually has a technical and specific boundary that does not in any way correspond to what you're putting on the map, which in terms of city parlance is usually called Outer State Street, which is basically anything north and west of Alamo and State, because half of the areas that you're collecting from are not in the San Roque neighborhood. That's number one. Number two, when you're continuing your conversation with the police department, and of course they're legendary for their budget altruism, so I know that they're looking for ways, even as we speak now, to reduce those costs and get more of the 10 hours into the field. But from what you said earlier, the penalty for deliberate public littering, like throwing private garbage into the street, is over $150. It's 3 times the parking ticket value. So if either the ticket enforcement people or the contractor sees this happening, they should be relaying that information to the enforcement people. And right there, the amount of money in the differential, would start to go down, at least until it hits some critical marketplace level. And then finally, our council liaison, Councilman Hotchkiss, urgent public businesses, keeping him from attending this meeting tonight, because if he were here, I think it would be interesting to find out, now that the mini depression is well abated, why the funding for this program is determined on enforcement revenue from residents rather than the benefit to the community and tourism of a clean downtown and clean, healthy neighborhoods. And at some point, perhaps the new city administrator, when that's officially confirmed, as part of the new budget process, can work with the council and try to see if this jury-rigged funding mechanism between Creeks and police and the Public Works Transportation and Streets budget is the best way to accomplish what it is that our elected officials are really trying to do in providing services to all the different neighborhoods, no matter what you call them. But, he's a tiger about his liaison work, and I'm sure he'll be here for our next meeting, so perhaps we can get him to share some of his thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mr. Moldaver. Good.
Got one more. I noticed.
You read the report.
Just a little bit. I noticed a discrepancy. It was actually a very good report, so thank you both for putting it together. I noticed a discrepancy. Let's see, or at least it seems like to me, between the what page is this? Page 5, the estimated revenue to the police department for 556,000, and then on the last chart on page 7. Total revenue to police department for enforcing 6,000 miles was 544,000. Are those supposed to be matching?
This one. 56. What was the other one? You found a typo. So we're just going to have to go back and redo his math.
That's fair. I just wanted to make sure we saw that.
What's it supposed to say?
And I won't take up any more time so we can get some public comment.
Any other questions?
Mr. Bullock has a question, I believe.
Sorry, one more. How many staff members do you have overseeing the street sweeping program?
We have a part of a supervisor, part of a maintenance coordinator, and a part of a clerical person. So this percentage of staff. Is it 1 FTE or less than 1 FTE? I think it's less than one full-time employee equivalent work overseeing both programs. So we have the staffing split between commercial and residential.
So once you have the contract with the street sweepers, then they're responsible for their own street sweeper machines and their employees. So why do you need a mechanic?
It's not a mechanic. It's a maintenance supervisor and a maintenance coordinator and our clerical person. These are the people who administer the contract. When we get complaints on a regular basis on the sweeping program, they're the ones who go out and investigate the complaints, respond to the citizen, coordinate with the contractor, processes the invoices that come on a monthly basis. It's our back of the office cost for administering the program.
Okay.
So we've cut that down to about $75,000.
Thank you.
I had one other follow-up on Mr. Benson's point earlier about the no parking zones, 9 to noon and 1 to 4. In my neighborhood, it's actually 8 to 11, so that would potentially expand the number of hours, because I see the parking citation enforcement officer come through at about 8:15, and then the street sweeper promptly at 8:25 right thereafter. So maybe the numbers here don't reflect.
I think there's one area where it's a little bit longer hours, and we found this working with the operator in the expansion areas after we did the west side. He was able to reduce the hours for enforcement. Some of the majority of the city is about 6 hours, but there's one. I think the west side does have 4 hours enforcement instead of the 3.
Okay. Well, I'm on the east side, but it's. I think it's still 3 hours. It's just shifted earlier, 8 to 11.
Some areas they start at 8 o'clock. Some areas they start at 9 o'clock. Really depends upon what's going on in the neighborhood and the routing, because the same operator may start over on the east side and then move to another area of the town. And so it's, the sweeper operator came in and he said, "This is how I can come in and sweep your city." So when we were establishing the different neighborhoods to expand the route and putting the routes together, one of the staff people that we were just talking about and the owner of the company drove every single street in the city to see how many cars and how many curb miles to determine what time they should start and what days of the week were the best to sweep. I had another question. Well, why don't you coordinate with the trash collection? Well, it's really difficult to do because trash collection is almost every day of the week in the city, and it's really difficult to do stuff like that. So we're doing the best we can. I think we have a very good program, and the fact that the amount of debris that's collecting has been pretty consistent for the last number of years is pretty telling how successful the program is.
Madam Chair, I have another question.
Yes.
We've been looking at the fiscal year 2015 budget. Do you guys have projection yet on the total budget for the next fiscal year, and particularly what the Measure B contribution would look like?
No, we don't. We're in the process of building our budget for the next 2 fiscal year, the next 2-year planning cycle. Staff is working on it right now. It's due the end of this month, to our Public Works admin person. So I won't really be looking at those numbers, and next week I'll be looking at it, but we won't be publicly discussing those numbers until April, when it's be submitted to the city administrator. Early March is when we go over our budget with him.
Okay. Any other questions?
Your public comment left.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Action, if you guys want to take any action, if you just want me to. Madam Chair, that item was agendized for action. If the committee wants to make a motion, take any kind of action, that's okay. If the committee wants to just leave their discussion comments as comments for me and for Mr. Allen and Mr. Fulmer, that's okay also.
Any thoughts from the committee?
Yeah, Madam Chair, it's a really interesting report that raised a lot of questions, and I want to thank my colleague for getting a lot of them on the record in terms of specific dollars and contract language. However, since Mr. Allen has indicated that the specific amount that they're requesting the specific budget for the street sweeping program that they intend to submit to the city council isn't quite ready yet. It would seem possibly premature to make comments now, except to note that I think that the program managers are making real efforts to economize, but as we've seen here for what some of the revenues being used for, which is kind of a stretch, for Measure B funds, that further economies might still be possible as we get into this year's city budget process.
And that's certainly another alternative. This committee reviews the detailed version of the Creeks Division budget. The budget subcommittee actually goes through the Creeks Division budget line by line. We have a line item for the street sweeping program, which will be plugged in by the time we start with those subcommittee meetings. So that is another opportunity for the committee to look at that, and I may have more information at that point as well.
So something that I was thinking about is that we're getting this annual report now, but would we be getting the same level of detail at that budget process point? Would we? Because, I mean, only having, how much the line item for Measure B is only tells a part of the picture as this report shows.
If the committee wants to have that level of detail and provides and asks for that tonight, I'll make sure I have that when I present the budget to the committee, and I'll make sure I have it at the subcommittee level, subcommittee meetings as well.
Can I ask, Madam Chair, these nice people in the audience who have already left had originally intended to be here for public comment, so I was trying to talk to them. With this wonderful detailed report from the Public Works, Transportation, and Streets Division, I was listening and following the slides about the money that's coming from parking and police revenue and from Measure B revenue, and I didn't hear a lot of discussion about how much is coming from Public Works, Transportation, and Streets budget, and how their potential role could help level off some of these costs if their negotiations with the police don't yield more savings. So was that something I missed?
I think that the staff report that was provided by the transportation staff does indicate the contribution of the Streets Division. I think it says $150,000 transfer from the street fund for the commercial program. The commercial program cost is more than that. So I assume the additional funds that are going to it actually shows as
It's the total,
as
not the
a
commercial.
deficit, and that they're going to use reserve funds to cover up the balance of the difference between the street fund contribution and the actual cost. And I think he made a comment maybe that they're coming in below cost, because I think he said they were not going to, their current projections show them not using the reserve. That's a little bit confusing.
So I'd be ready to make a motion that in the Creeks Department budget process, we ask for the Streets Department accounting on where they come up with the amount that they're requesting from the Creeks Department. Unless someone wants to rephrase that.
Okay. Is there a second? Or any further discussion?
I'd like to second that, but there are a few, I think, just additional things I want to. Is that? Can I second and add on to it?
We can continue discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
After approval of the motion maker, you can.
Feel free.
Well,
You can add to the
let
motion
me just run
if
down
it's
what
approved by the
I'm
motion
thinking
maker.
that everyone can we can talk about it. I mean, there are a few things that came up today that I think are important to highlight, and I don't think we need to resolve them today. But I would like to bring light to them here. First, the issue of the parking enforcement hours and the street sweeping program paying for, it seems like 4 hours per enforcer that is not actually doing any street sweeping enforcing. Second, the NPDES permit fee, which I understand that there can be a reasonable debate about where the money is coming from for that, whether it's from police enforcement revenue or from the Measure B funding. But it seems to me, since we're making up the shortfall, any additional monies, any additional costs in the residential program is coming from us. Let's see, and then to Mr. Bullock's or point already about a part of the budget process, getting the specific line items. And then I think to Mr. Moldaver's point about looking for further efficiencies in the program. I think that's a great point. And then just lastly, and obviously everyone can decide what is appropriate here and what is not, I think that we should be having a discussion about changes to the street sweeping program to be targeting, this conversation came up, I think, last year, about targeting street sweeping when we have wet weather instead of doing consistently all year round, because that's when we're going to get the most water quality bang for our buck, potentially. And that's it.
Any further discussion?
So what is the motion then?
I think now, with Mr. Bullock's approval, it's been amended, as just stated, to include, how many points did you get, Cameron? 6?
I have 5.
Okay.
Do you have it written down, James, or you want me to take a?
So the parking enforcement hours, the MPDS permit, the line item in our budget process, sweeping for dry/wet weather, further efficiencies in the program, and I don't know if that was 5. Did I miss anything?
Okay. I'm now at 6. I'm now at 6. I know which one I was missing before.
Okay.
And what's the 6 that wasn't just
Okay,
stated?
so I had started off with Mr. Bullock's motion that the Creeks Division staff should get detailed street sweeping budget information before the Creeks Committee budget process so that it could be reviewed. And then added to that was investigate further the question of why the street sweeping program is paying for 3 full-time, 10-hour per day parking enforcement officers when the enforcement is only 6 hours per day. The third thing is to look into the issue of the street sweeping residential program paying the full cost of the NPDES permit fee. Fourth, look for further efficiencies in the program. Fifth, target street sweeping for wet weather instead of year-round to get the biggest water quality bang for the buck. Actually, that's the last one I have, so I've got 5. Is that everything?
Yes, and just to clarify the efficiencies point, that will include our discussion about the frequency of certain neighborhoods being swept every week versus those that are swept every other week.
Okay.
Do we know is that $27,000 for the NPDES permit? Amount of the permit fee?
Yes.
Madam Chair, before we vote,
Yes.
for the benefit of all the residents who are watching this as a transition before they go to Jeopardy or ESPN, I know it's really hard when we're having conversation, any city board or commission, and we start throwing acronyms around. I was wondering if the staff could explain what this permit is that we're talking about, just in terms of abbreviations, so they'll have a better understanding of what the concern is.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Moldaver. The NPDES permit stands for National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and it's a permitting process under the Federal Clean Water Act. Every city in the United States with 100,000, or excuse me, even smaller than that now, probably with more than 50,000 people, is required to have a NPDES permit for the discharge of stormwater from that jurisdiction into the creeks and oceans and lakes and rivers in the United States. And so the city is regulated under federal law for everything that runs off of public and private property, and any contamination that gets into our storm drains, creeks, and ocean. And so it's an annual permit fee that the city pays to the Regional Water Quality Control Board for the privilege of being regulated by them.
And does that fee typically come out of the Public Works transportation budget?
Yes, as I mentioned, specifically in the funding guidelines for Measure B, it says that it shall not pay for this particular permit fee. Part of the reason for that is when Measure B was adopted, the idea was that it was going to, the funds for Measure B were going to supplement what the city was already doing for water quality. In other words, to try to improve water quality, not just to maintain the status quo. And so that was a permit that was required and is required of every other city in the country. So it was something that was deemed to not be appropriate to use Measure B funds for. I believe that went to City Council, and that issue actually went to City Council in 2003, and they directed it to be paid for by the Streets Fund.
And may I make one other comment? He made an assertion that Measure B was instituted and part of the ballot was to include street sweeping in the measure.
It says that here in the report.
Yeah, it says it in his report. Could you speak to that for a moment, Cameron?
Yes, I think what he said was accurate. There's nothing in Measure B itself that talks about street sweeping, and it has been an issue over the years, ever since Measure B was passed, as to whether or not it should fund street sweeping. And so the what Mr. Allen, I think, was referring to, and I think I have it in my file, was that in a ballot argument that was submitted by the proponents of Measure B, that went out with the sample ballot, it mentioned this. I know I have it in here somewhere. It mentioned the street sweeping. Oh, here it is. Gosh, I know I had it here. Sorry. It mentioned the street sweeping program as part of that. So I think it did have the mayor at the time, mayor's signature as one of the supporters on there. So I think that that's a valid statement to make, and I think that the idea was that there was an intent to expand the street sweeping program from its current state. So, so to the extent there was an existing program that was the downtown area. It was commercial, but it was also the adjoining area. So it's not necessarily all commercial, but it was commercial in the adjoining area. And then that program has been expanded over time. And those expansions were largely funded out of Measure B, even to the extent of, back in 2002, I believe it was, Measure B provided a loan. It's characterized as a loan in the staff report to the City Council to kind of jumpstart the program, and I think that went to purchasing and installing the enforcement signs and things like that. And the loan was about $230,000, I think. And there's some language in there that said if there were ever a surplus coming in from citation revenues, that money would come back to the Measure B program. So I think that's accurate to say that. Now, having said that, the purpose of Measure B and the purpose of that street sweeping was to improve water quality. It wasn't for the other stated purpose of the street sweeping program, which is aesthetics. And so, we have done some research, and we have participated with the street sweeping staff in a webinar that talked about effectiveness of street sweeping for water quality. That study there was a fairly large study down in the city of San Diego. They found that the ideal number of sweeps per year is 17 sweeps per year, a little less than every other week, to get your biggest bang for your water quality buck. If you do that, and there are a lot of things to balance. If you do that all during the wet season, you're going to have rainy days where, as Mr. Allen pointed out, they won't send the sweepers out, so you lose all of that. And in terms of costs, like he said, if you let things build up, then you may have to run the street sweeper by twice. But I did notice that in the downtown areas, they were picking up about 145 pounds a week pass through those locations, and in the place they were doing every other week, they were picking up about 350 pounds. So it was almost consistent. But in San Diego, one of the things that study found was almost no matter how often they ran the sweepers through, they picked up the same volume or same weight of debris. It didn't change that much over time. So so it may be that you could decrease the frequency to every other week and get a bigger bang for your street sweeping dollar. I just don't know how that plays out, as Mr. Allen was saying, with your enforcement revenue and that balance. And then the last thing I would say that didn't get pointed out, but that I noticed, was the cost of providing the parking enforcement has been going up. The revenue from parking enforcement has been going down. At some point, those are going to cross. And right now, from the numbers were a little confusing in here. They said there was a typo in there, but right now it looks like the net of that was about $89,000 to the positive. But at one time, the net on that was, pushing $600,000 or $700,000. So it's really changed a lot. At some point, under this model, you would have Measure B starting to fund parking, the parking enforcement program, and so it's. I don't know when we're going to hit that point, but at some point, it becomes more expensive to enforce than the return.
Then the line item will become more important, because they should not equivocate on where the money's coming from for the MPDS program and the citations. We should be able to see and link where the money's coming from and what's being contributed to. Anything else?
I just wanted to say that to the viewing audience and the rest of the city that is not viewing right now, I know how much of a pain it is to get those green envelopes on your car, and $50 is a lot of money for a parking ticket. But based on this discussion, you can see that it does go towards funding this really important program, which is helping keep our creeks and ocean clean. So as much as you can look at it as, not just this fine that you have to pay to the city, but something that's helping water quality in the city, I think that's a good way. But we appreciate everyone that's contributed to it.
Okay, so with those points that were outlined by Mr. Benson, we lost one of our voting members, but I think, can we still pass it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I will approve the amendment to my original motion to include all those points.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, no further discussion. All in favor? Aye.
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 None opposed. Okay. Our second business item, election of vice chair. I'm thinking that his departure was.
Oh.
There he is.
Do you want to see if Mr. Moldaver wants to
Yes.
get his vote on the
Would
last
you like to
item?
join the vote, Mr. Moldaver, on the motion of Mr. Bullocks as amended?
Madam Chair, I waited as long as I could, but I thought I thought that independent city action to verify that municipal plumbing systems were in proper working order was really important during this drought.
That's wise.
But I vote yes on the motion.
Okay. And the motion carried unanimously. Then on to our next business item, election of vice chair. Mr. Benson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So every year in January, the committee elects a vice chair. Normally, that person serves as vice chair for the year, and the current vice chair takes over at the February meeting and serves as chair through the following January. Last year, Mr. Hawkins was elected vice chair. He and I have had some conversations. He doesn't want to move into the chair position at this time, and I'm not sure I think he wants to be a regular member of the committee.
That is
but I'm not.
correct.
Yeah, that is correct. So he's served admirably as vice chair. He's filled in on multiple occasions and done an excellent job. But at this point, I think we need to. I need to put it back to the committee to determine who will serve as chair in the year going forward, and then also elect a vice chair. So in the absence of in the chair's absence, they can run the meeting this year, and hopefully begin to serve as chair next February 2016.
Right. Well, I'll thank Mr. Hawkins for being a fantastic vice chair and continuing to be a valuable committee member.
Thanks, and I think I speak for the rest of the committee saying thank you for your leadership and facilitating the meetings for the past year.
You're welcome. So with that, do we have any nominations for vice chair? I'm happy if it's convenient for the committee to continue to serve as chair for 2015.
I would nominate Mr. Moldaver as the vice chair for next year or the upcoming year.
Thank you, Mr. Bullock. It's not a question of Brown Act conversations, but before the meeting started, I indicated that my experience with that category is vast and diverse. So sure, I'd be willing to do that on the proviso that the chair cannot leave the county on meeting days without written permission from the staff.
That will not be approved. All right. Do we have a second then to the motion?
I'd be happy to second that.
Okay. All in favor? Aye.
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 Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Moldaver, and everyone. And I guess she didn't last time. I can't speak for her this time. And then, without objection from the committee, we will continue with Mr. Smith as our chair for the upcoming year. Thank you for volunteering to do that.
You're welcome. All right. We have a motion to adjourn? Seeing no other business or comment? Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thanks.